Hi, this is Richard Howe. Welcome to a new episode of Civil War Lowell, a series of virtual tours that explore the experience of Lowell, Massachusetts in the American Civil War. Episode 1, Lords of the Loom, was about the decades before the Civil War and the conflict in Lowell between the economic interests of cotton and the recognition that slavery, which was responsible for the picking of that cotton, was morally wrong, and about the abolitionist movement that grew up in the city. Episode 2, Minutemen of 1861, was about the 6th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry Regiment, which was the first unit from the North to answer President Lincoln's call for volunteers to put down the rebellion after Fort Sumter had been fired upon. This episode 3 is called Butler Saves the Union. It's about Benjamin Butler, who was a prominent lawyer in Lowell, who became a general first in the Massachusetts militia and then in the regular army of the United States. In the opening month, from April 19th till the end of May, Butler showed decisive leadership and action, which I think are underappreciated in American history. And so that's what this episode is about. Just to review, November of 1860 presidential election, Abraham Lincoln was elected. He was the first Republican ever elected president. He defeated 3 opponents. But as soon as Lincoln was elected, the state of South Carolina seceded from the Union, and it was followed by 6 other states from the Deep South, and they left the Union in January of 1861. Now, back then, the new president didn't take office until the beginning of March, so there was this period where these other states seceded, but the administration of James Buchanan, the incumbent president of the United States, didn't really do anything to stop them. Well, what happened was on Friday, April 12th, the South Carolina militia started firing upon Fort Sumter, which was a Union or a federal fortification on an island in the center of Charleston Harbor. There were 85 United States soldiers there. The bombardment lasted for about 36 hours, a day and a half, until the garrison of the fort surrendered. And despite hundreds and hundreds of shells striking the fort, not one of the 85 soldiers within the fort were killed by the fire. In response to the firing at Fort Sumter, Abraham Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteer troops from the northern states to come to Washington to help suppress the rebellion. One of the first units to move out was the Lowell-based Massachusetts 6th Infantry Regiment. Now, as that regiment passed through the city of Baltimore on its way to Washington on April 19, 1861, a mob of pro-Southern protesters tried to prevent the soldiers from passing through, and they started throwing things at them and eventually fired at them, killing 4 of the troops, wounding 32. The soldiers fired back, killing about a dozen of the protesters, and the 6th Regiment finally made it through Baltimore and got all the way to Washington, D.C. 2 of the 4 soldiers who were killed were Luther Ladd and Addison Whitney, 2 young mill workers from Lowell. They are honored by the Ladd and Whitney Monument, which is now in front of Lowell City Hall, which is also their burial place. And they did reach the regiment, which was about 1,000 men, reached the capital, Washington, D.C., on the evening of April 19th, and they were billeted in the U.S. Capitol building, which was still under construction. Now, in response to the riot, George Brown, the mayor of Baltimore, who was sympathetic to the South, said that he didn't want any more Union troops coming through his city because of all the destruction and the death that would occur. And so he ordered members of his police force to burn some of the railroad bridges that approached the city from the north. And they did that, and this effectively it not only cut Baltimore off from the north, it cut Washington off from the north. Because you can see from this screen print of a map from Philadelphia to the north. There's a straight line to Washington, D.C. that runs through Baltimore, and that's really the only rail line that directly connected Philadelphia, which was sort of the gateway from the northern states to Washington. A couple of other geographic notes from this map. In the bottom right-hand corner, the blue arrow points to at the entrance to the Chesapeake Bay, Fortress Monroe, which was another one of these United States Army forts along the East Coast. They were designed to protect from invaders from across the Atlantic, but they were still possessed by United States Army forces, even though they were within Confederate territory. And Fort Monroe was deep inside Virginia. It's actually at Hampton Roads, right to the entrance near Norfolk, Virginia. And the gray symbol shows where Richmond is, and the other gray symbol shows Alexandria, Virginia, which is just across the Potomac River from Washington. And that's there as a reminder that that Washington, D.C. is really right next to Virginia. So the 6th Regiment arrived on the evening of April 19th, and it was critical that they reach Washington because there were no troops in Washington. And from the prior screen, you saw the proximity of a southern state, Virginia. And so just to defend the capital and the cabinet and the president, troops from the north were needed. But the 6th Regiment was the only one that got there. On April 24th, 5 days after the 6th Regiment arrived, President Abraham Lincoln came and he spoke with the men of the 6th, many of whom were from Lowell. And he said, I don't believe there is any North. The 7th Regiment is a myth. Rhode Island is not known in our geography any longer. You are the only Northern realities. Now, the 7th Regiment that Lincoln was talking about was the 7th New York Regiment. That was a well thought of unit from New York City. And there was a lot of attention paid to its departure from New York, but it was stuck because it couldn't get beyond Baltimore, or couldn't get through Baltimore because of the burning of the bridges. Rhode Island also had units that were en route to Washington, but they couldn't make it there either. And so Lincoln was really distraught because he was concerned that that Washington, D.C. would be captured in a quick strike by the Confederates. Well, Massachusetts had 4 regiments of volunteer troops that were all well trained and well equipped in April of 1861. We've already heard about the 6th, that made it through to Washington, but upon mobilization, 2 of the regiments, the 3rd, which was based in New Bedford, and the 4th, which was based in Quincy, were ordered to go to Fort Monroe, which you saw previously was in the Chesapeake Bay at the entrance to Norfolk, Virginia. The 8th Regiment, which was headquartered in Lynn, Massachusetts, was destined for Washington. And it too was stuck in Philadelphia because they had no way of getting through to Baltimore and then on to Washington. And so here's again that map with the blue symbol showing the location of the 4 Massachusetts regiments on about the April 20th, 1861. You can see in the lower right-hand corner, the 3rd and the 4th Massachusetts, they had a relatively easy ship ride from Boston Harbor all the way down the Atlantic coast where they could land and disembark at Fort Monroe. The 6th Massachusetts already was in Washington, but the 8th Massachusetts, which was desperately needed for the defense of Washington, was stuck in Philadelphia. And that's where Ben Butler came along. Butler was a lawyer in Lowell. But he was also a colonel in the Massachusetts militia. He held no command in April of 1861. But he and a number of other officers were colonels. He was not the senior most of the colonels, but he thought Butler thought pretty highly of himself, and so he thought he should be the commander of all the Massachusetts troops. And so the person who would make that decision would not be the War Department in Washington, but the governor of the state of Massachusetts, who was the commander in chief of all the state militia forces. And that person was John Andrew, shown here on the left. Andrew was a Republican. He was an abolitionist. Butler was a Democrat. And while he didn't like slavery, he didn't do much to oppose it. He was more interested in preserving the Union. That was until Fort Sumter was fired upon. And then Andrew and Butler, who in peacetime were very vicious enemies of each other in politics, kind of entered a grudging truce to work together. Butler went to see Governor Andrew to make his case as to why he should be the military commander of the Massachusetts troops. And on the train into Boston on that day after Fort Sumter had been fired upon, Butler found James B. Kearny, who was a very successful banker from Lowell. Kearny had come to Lowell really with some furniture, no real fortune, and he founded a bank, which ultimately became the Lowell Institution for Savings. He was very successful at it, and by 1861, he had branched out to Boston, and so he was a big player in the Boston and the entire Massachusetts financial scene. A little Lowell footnote here is Kearny had sent his children to Lowell High School for their education, and he had been so pleased by the experience they had there that he donated a sum of money to the high school, an endowment to be used to award 6 medals for academic excellence to the top 3 male students and the top 3 female students each year at Lowell High School. And the awarding of the so-called Kearny Medal continues up until today. So anybody from Lowell who's heard of the Kearny Medals, this is the gentleman who started that, and that's who it's named after. Well, anyway, as Kearny and Butler spoke on the train, Butler mentioned to Kearny that he was on his way to the governor, and Butler brought up the issue of financing the war. The state didn't have a big contingency fund that the governor could tap into to pay to ship these regiments to the South. So the money had to come from somewhere. And Butler persuaded Kearny, out of a sense of patriotism, to not only put up a large sum of money from his bank in the form of a loan to the state, but to enlist a number of other major banks in Boston to do the same, to give the governor adequate funds. Kearny agreed to do this during this train trip from Lowell to Boston. And Butler told Kearny that since he was on his way to see the governor anyway, he would bring him the good news. And Kearny said that was fine. He'd go off and find the other bankers and get them lined up with their financing. Well, when Butler got in to see the governor, he bypassed a colonel who was senior to him in the militia, went in to see the governor, and he basically made him an offer he couldn't refuse. It essentially was, make me the commander of the Massachusetts militia, and I'll be sure that you get all the money you need from James Kearny and his fellow bankers. Andrew was desperate to get the money. He didn't have time to double check Butler's story, so he agreed to it. Butler walked out of the office, promoted to general, and he was given command of the Massachusetts militia. And Andrew did, of course, get the money. So Butler headed to Philadelphia, where he hooked up with the 8th Massachusetts Regiment. Now, the normal trip of a train from Philadelphia to Baltimore would take the train to the Susquehanna River at Perryville, Maryland. And there was no train bridge that went across the very wide river there. Instead, the cars would be ferried across the river on large ferry boats. Well, there was no point in getting across the river to the other side and continuing on to Baltimore, because bridges further down the track had been burned and there were no ferries there. So what Butler did instead was he commandeered the largest ferry boat there was. It was called the Maryland, and he unloaded the entire 8th Massachusetts Regiment on it, and he ordered the captain to sail down the Chesapeake Bay from the Susquehanna River to Annapolis, Maryland, which is southeast of Baltimore. And the reason he did that was he knew that there was a secondary train line that ran from Annapolis to a place called Annapolis Junction, which was on the main line from Baltimore to Washington. So that would effectively bypass Baltimore. And if Butler could get that route open, he could resume the flow of troops into Washington. Well, the Maryland carrying the 8th Massachusetts, and here's a sign from the Susquehanna River and its ferry. Well, the Maryland, the ferry boat containing the 8th Massachusetts pulled up to the dock in Annapolis, and the first thing you see when you do that is the United States Naval Academy. And this is what the harbor looks like from the Naval Academy. And when Butler came ashore, he spotted the USS Constitution, Old Ironsides, which was well known to anybody from Massachusetts. This was being used by the Naval Academy as a training ship. It was no longer in active service in the United States Navy. Well, many of the officers who worked at the Naval Academy were pro-Southern in their sentiments, and they were going to defect to the South, and they decided they were going to take the Old Ironsides with them. So when Butler pulled up, they were just about to get underway. Well, he immediately had them arrested, and he had the Constitution secured to the wharf. This is what Butler said. For the route to Washington, D.C., we could not sail into the Potomac, and the rail line from Annapolis to Annapolis Junction was the only route in. Troops were unwelcome in Annapolis, finding reluctance to provide provisions and locomotives disabled to prevent their travel. And so the people of Annapolis, just like the people of Baltimore, were pro-Southern in their sentiments, and they didn't want the Northern troops passing through their city to get to Washington. So what some people in Annapolis had done was they had torn up some of the rail line, and the only locomotive that was in Annapolis at the time, they had sabotaged it so that it could not be operated. Well, Butler's unit was a militia regiment, which meant that the men had peacetime occupations and that they had only mobilized when the war had started. So among the men that were in the 8th Regiment were a number of railroad workers. So Butler dispatched them to repair the rails. And there were actually some men who had worked on that very locomotive, which had been made in Lynn, Massachusetts. They were able to get it running, and pretty soon Butler had the train route from Annapolis to Annapolis Junction running. And as this sign says, this is a sign outside the Naval Academy. It says the 8th Massachusetts Infantry reached Annapolis April 21st, 1861 on the railroad ferry Maryland. Colonel Benjamin Butler forwarded his and the 7th New York Infantry regiments to Washington. Shortly, he was directed to prevent the legislature from acting on secession from the Union. Now, that would be the Maryland legislature, and Annapolis is the capital of Maryland. So Butler very willingly marched some of his troops to the capital and arrested the entire Maryland legislature and put them into custody at the Naval Academy. Butler also got the trains moving from Annapolis to Annapolis Junction, which is where this place is located. You might recognize this building as the National Security Agency. So the modern name for Annapolis Junction is Fort Meade, Maryland. And if you've ever driven from Baltimore to Washington, D.C., you drive right by the exit for Fort Meade, and you also get right on the main rail line going into Washington. Well, that opened up the flow of troops. On April 25th, the 7th New York and the 8th Massachusetts reached Washington. 5 days later, there were more than 10,000 Northern troops in Washington, and enough to defend it from any strike coming from the Confederates. In recognition of his service, Butler was given command of the newly created Department of Annapolis by the United States Army. But let's step back and look at the big picture, really what the threat was to Washington, because it wasn't just some trivial or ephemeral thing, it was very real. And consider Harper's Ferry. Here's a picture of it. Harper's Ferry lies about 30 miles northwest of Washington, D.C. It's at the confluence of the Potomac River and the Shenandoah River. We're maybe familiar, well, so there it's shown on the map in pink in the left center. We're probably most familiar with Harper's Ferry because it's a site of where John Brown tried to initiate an uprising of slaves in 1859, an action that cost him his life and probably sped the way to war. One of the reasons John Brown went to Harper's Ferry was because it was an arsenal. It was owned by the United States government. It's where they made rifles for the American military. You can see the rifle up at the top is a Harper's Ferry Model 1803 rifle, and these are others that were made at the Harper's Ferry Arsenal. So on April 18th, the day before the 6th Regiment was involved in the riot in Baltimore, the Virginia militia seized the arsenal at Harper's Ferry and took control of it. And in doing that, they gained thousands of rifles and hundreds of pounds of ammunition and powder. But the strategic significance of Harper's Ferry was really that it was a major rail link that connected Washington, D.C. to the northwestern part of the country. So by getting on a train at Harper's Ferry, Virginia troops could be in downtown Washington within about an hour or two. And this posed a major threat of invasion to Washington. Again, here's the map just showing you the proximity of Harper's Ferry to Washington. And let's look further at the big picture. There's a place called the Gosport Navy Yard. That was the major naval installation of the United States Navy Atlantic Fleet. There were a number of ships there that were under repairs in dry dock, and it was where all the stores were: cannon, gunpowder, shells, all kinds of naval stores were there. And that's now known as the Norfolk Naval Base. It's the oldest naval installation in the United States Navy. And this shows you where Gosport is. It's right near Fort Monroe, Virginia. Now, Gosport in April was still under control of the United States Navy, but the Virginia militia moved against it. And as they approached, the sailors and their officers at Gosport decided to burn the place. And unfortunately, the United States frigate, the Merrimack, which is shown here, which happens to be named after the Merrimack River, which passes through Lowell, was in dry dock. And so it couldn't be moved. And so instead, the United States Navy burned the Merrimack. But the fire only consumed the upper portion of the ship. So when the Confederates finally occupied the Gosport Naval Yard, the hull of the Merrimack remained intact, and it was in dry dock. Here's a picture of it burning. And so what the Southerners did was they repurposed the hull of the Merrimack, and they created the ironclad ship that they called the CSS, for Confederate States Ship Virginia. It's still known as the Merrimack, and many of you are familiar with the first battle of two ironclad ships in history in 1862 between the United States Navy Monitor and the Confederate ship Merrimack. And that's shown here. Well, that all happened at Gosport Naval Yard. Here's a picture of the Virginia underway. And so the Gosport Naval Yard had fallen to the Confederates, and that's why Fort Monroe was really such an important installation to hold. Well, Butler was not one to sit idly by once the trains were moving on to Washington. He had other things to accomplish. Because there were so many troops other troops in Washington, D.C., Butler was able to regain command of the 6th Massachusetts Regiment. And he used that unit to go by train to a place called Relay House, which is just south of Baltimore. And it was a major rail installation. It's still used by trains today. And the reason it was so important strategically was because of this structure. It's called the Thomas Viaduct. It's over the Patapsco River. It carries all these train lines, and that's what Relay House is about. So if that had been taken and destroyed by pro-Confederate sympathizers in Maryland, it would have been very difficult to reconstruct that and resume the rail lines. But, and here's a picture or drawing from the same time of a artillery battery from Massachusetts guarding that same stretch that you saw in the more contemporary photograph. Butler wasn't done. Just a week later, he continued up in another surprise attack on May 13th. In a driving rainstorm, he and the entire 6th Regiment pulled up in a train from the south into Baltimore. It was raining so hard, nobody really paid attention to them, and they marched to this place, Federal Hill, which is across the inner basin of the harbor, and it overlooks downtown Baltimore. And so when the people of Baltimore woke up the next morning, Butler and the 6th Regiment had established a fortress atop of Federal Hill, complete with cannons that completely dominated the skyline. And this is a drawing of what the people saw. And this is a picture of the house that Butler seized as his headquarters. Well, Butler immediately arrested the mayor of Baltimore, the police chief, and many other major officials. And he took control of Baltimore, and in just a few days, Union engineers had reconstructed the bridges that had been burned north of the city, and the main rail line from Philadelphia to Washington reopened. Now, General Winfield Scott, who was the commander-in-chief of the United States Army, was very upset with Butler because Scott had convinced President Lincoln that it would take at least 10,000 soldiers and 3 months to capture Baltimore. And he was in the process of planning a major operation to take the city when Butler, without asking anybody's permission, just sort of flew in and seized the city. And this really was a great embarrassment to Scott. He portrayed it, though, as Butler disobeying orders. So he relieved Butler of command of the Department of Annapolis, and he sent him down to Fortress Monroe, which he felt was out of the way. It was surrounded by the Confederates, so Butler couldn't do any harm there. And there was a logical connection because 2 regiments of Massachusetts troops, the 3rd and the 4th, were both stationed there. Well, Butler arrived down at Fort Monroe, and just as he was getting settled in, here's a picture of Fort Monroe. One night, 3 slaves came across the wall into the fort. They were owned by a Virginia militia colonel, and he had ordered them to dig entrenchments in front of Fort Monroe. These were going to be used in case the fort was ever assaulted. Now, the Union policy at this time was not to take any slaves into their ranks. Lincoln was very concerned that the 3 border states of Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri, which had many slave owners, that if he was too aggressive in freeing slaves, that those 3 states would switch over and go over to the Confederacy, something that he said would absolutely lose the war for the North. Butler was aware of this policy, but Butler, as a very astute lawyer, was also knowledgeable of the law of warfare. And that said that if you come into possession of the enemy's property, if that property has been used to further the enemy's war aims, you're legally authorized to seize that property as contraband of war. So Butler turned the Southerners' argument against them, that if slaves are property and the slaves are being used to further the Southern war aims, if the North is able to capture those slaves, they can be treated as contraband of war and they don't have to be returned. And that was the argument that Butler gave to the Virginia colonel when he came forward under a white flag asking for his slaves back. And that's also the story that, or the message that Butler telegraphed to Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln, who's also a lawyer, saw the wisdom of that position. He authorized it, he validated it, And many historians now say that Butler's decision at Fort Monroe to treat slaves that came into Union lines as contraband of war was the first step towards the Emancipation Proclamation by Lincoln several years later. So that's the story of the first month of the war. In light of all that happened after that, with big battles such as Gettysburg and Antietam, we sometimes lose sight of the precarious situation that Lincoln and the nation's capital found themselves in the opening month of the war. And I think Ben Butler, for his decisive leadership during that critical first month, is sometimes given short shrift by historians. So hopefully this remedies that. Thank you for joining me today for episode 3 of Civil War Lowell. Please look for future episodes of Lowell in the Civil War.